Welcome back, everybody. Let's get started on chapters 5 and 6. It's going to be a lot of thermodynamics, biophysics, and bioenergetics. So chapter 5, we'll look at bioenergetics. The main focus here is going to be looking at delta G again, and a thermodynamic constant called K equilibrium, and what that tells us about biochemical reactions in the cell. And then in chapter 6, we'll look at some enzymology and look to see what we can learn about how enzymes work in cells, given their active site structure, specificity, and their kinetics, that kind of thing. So let's get going and start off by taking a look at some pretty basic bioenergetics review to start with, just in terms of how organisms obtain energy from their environments, and then we'll look at how energy flows through the biosphere, and we'll take it from there. So, as you probably know, pretty much all life on Earth derives its source of energy from the sun. Now, there are some exemptions to that. For example, we could think about organisms that are living in deep sea hydrothermal vents where there's no light, and for example bacteria and other microorganisms, archaebacteria for example, living down there, are obtaining their energy from reduced inorganic compounds, and that's where the energy enters the environment. But we're really going to have this idea that life on Earth is supported by the fusion reactions that occur in the giant burning ball of fire in the sky, also known as the sun. We can then divide kind of organisms on Earth into and cells for that matter, into two kind of camps: phototrophs or chemotrophs. And that is their source of energy. And then we can also think about the source of carbon. So if we think about the source of carbon, you're either an autotroph or you're a heterotroph. And these words, phototroph, chemotroph, autotroph, and heterotroph, they're often mixed up and used interchangeably, and we want to avoid that. So that's the thing we're really going to kind of drill home here, is the appropriate use of this nomenclature. So if you're a phototroph, you capture light energy from the sun, and then you transform it via photosynthesis into chemical energy, and ultimately that will be stored as ATP and used by the cell. And so obviously the light energy, in combination with water and carbon dioxide, is used to form simple sugars, which can then be built into more complex molecules, all the kinds of molecules the plant cell needs, and ultimately some of those are going to be broken down by the reactions of cellular respiration, which we'll come to in a moment, to make the molecule ATP. Most organisms, most plants, are photoautotrophs. That means their source of carbon is the oxidized form of carbon dioxide. Now, when you think about a plant, if you put a plant in the dark, it can't be behaving as a phototroph. And in that sense, it's also behaving as a chemotroph, because it's obtaining its nutrients from the carbon dioxide that was reduced into the form of sugars during photosynthesis in the light. So there's a little bit of ambiguity here, but generally we would say that a plant is a photoautotroph, but there are parts of the plant which can't be phototrophic and they can't be autotrophic. Roots, for example, root cells in the plant, they cannot be photoautotrophic because they're not exposed to light or carbon dioxide. So the cells there would be chemoheterotrophs, because they're obtaining energy from reduced organics, sugars and starch, and they're obtaining their carbon dioxide in the form of reduced organics, carbon and starch, carbon in the form of starch. And so it gets a little bit confusing if we're talking about the organism's nutritional strategy or a cell's nutritional strategy, and so bear that in mind. Your photoautotrophs are basically your plants, your algae, your cyanobacteria, and your photosynthetic bacteria. The big one that people want to put in there are fungi, and fungi are chemoheterotrophs, so they don't go in with the photoautotrophs. Now, some bacteria are photoheterotrophs, so they're a little bit weird. They take solar energy and use it for some cellular behaviors, but then they rely on the intake of organic carbon compounds for other cellular activities. So this is the beautiful thing about biology, is that evolution gives us this wide diversity of nutritional strategies whereby lots of different types of organisms can use many different types of ecological niches. And so you have to look at the environment and what's available in the environment, and that will give some clues about the nutritional strategy of the cells you find in that environment. Chemotrophs. Chemotrophs are a little bit easier. You and I are chemotrophs. We're chemoheterotrophs. So we obtain energy, that's the chemotroph part, we obtain energy from oxidizing the chemical bonds in molecules, which can be either organic or inorganic. Now we use organic things, but there are lots of bacteria which use inorganic things. And so they are chemotrophs, but they don't use organic chemicals. They get their energy from other reduced inorganic compounds. Such as, let me see, hydrogen sulfide would be a good example, hydrogen gas, those kinds of things. And then they use carbon dioxide as a carbon source, so they would be chemoautotrophs. So there's some weird bacteria that do that kind of stuff. The cells that we're going to look at, mainly animal cells, they're going to be chemoheterotrophic cells. So they ingest and they use chemical compounds, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins to provide both energy and carbon for cellular needs. So this is the animals, protozoa, fungi, a lot of different types of bacteria, all chemotrophs. And so that's shown over here on the right. This step in, it's maybe summarizing this step of cellular respiration where pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA via this oxidation reaction. So that's a little bit about nutritional strategies. Let's go away from thinking about the cellular to thinking about the ecosystem level, and then put organisms and their cells in the ecosystem context. If we start over here on the left, like we just said, really, phototrophs are the producers in the ecosystems. They're going to use sunlight to produce the food for the rest of the food chain, and the exception to that is organisms in deep sea vents, which are obtaining energy in the form of reduced inorganics that are spewing out through these deep sea geysers. So plants are producers producing compounds for every other organism to consume, and so the plants are taking carbon dioxide, light energy, water, and producing really all the other molecules that we need, the chemoheterotrophs, the fishes, the penguins, the monkeys, the fungi, those kinds of things, need for survival. Now, as the energy comes into the ecosystem and the producers are engaged in the process of photosynthesis and other anabolic processes to build up macromolecules, there is some heat lost to the environment. So the reason we say that energy flows through the biosphere is that ultimately the energy starts off in the fusion reactions of the sun, but it streams or it flows and ends up being dissipated into the environment. There are some cases where organisms which don't regulate their body temperature use the heat produced by these cellular activities to maintain some kind of heat balance. That's kind of unusual, though. There are some plants that do this. There are some obviously some animals which do this as well. But ultimately, all the energy that comes in from the fusion reactions of the sun ends up in the environment. So then the organic compounds produced by the phototrophs, if we look up here, those organic compounds and that oxygen being produced by photosynthesis and by the breakdown of the photoautotrophs in the ecosystem, we find the chemotrophs using that material. So they take in the reduced compounds and they oxidize them to release energy. And again, no process is 100% efficient, so again there is heat loss. So we've got heat loss to the environment in the production stage, heat loss to the environment over here by the consumers, and so ultimately all the energy that comes through the ecosystem into the ecosystem rather is going to be lost in the form of heat. So there's this massive flow of energy from the sun ultimately out to heat, and heat is generally not a usable form of energy, and so really that's lost to us, and ultimately that is what's going to give us the increase in entropy in the universe. So even though when we look at the metabolism, the collective sum of all the processes in the cells of these organisms and these chemoheterotrophs over here, even though there are anabolic building up processes in there, ultimately those processes really are going to all release heat, and that increases the entropy in the universe. So all of the reactions, the combined metabolisms here, end up increasing the entropy in the universe. So let's go back to just thinking about the oxidation processes which happen in the chemotrophs and in the phototrophs as the phototrophs break down organics that they need to derive molecules like ATP from. So if you think back to introductory biology and chemistry, oxidation is the removal of electrons. So it's when a compound loses electrons, and we usually follow that by the loss of a hydrogen, so that's a proton plus an electron. And when that oxidation occurs, there's usually a release of energy, and that is then harnessed and used to do some work. The contrast of that, or the opposite of that, reduction, that involves adding electrons, often, again, a hydrogen, a proton, and an electron, and that often requires an input of energy. And you've learned about these in terms of the glucose oxidation that occurs during cellular respiration in the phototrophs, and also occurs in the phototrophs and in the chemotrophs, whereby carbohydrates, glucose, in the presence of oxygen, is converted to carbon dioxide and water with the liberation of energy that can then be harnessed to make ATP. And then you've learned about the phototrophs, which reduce carbon dioxide, and so they take light energy, carbon dioxide, electrons from water to produce carbohydrates. So that kind of gives us the big picture, starting from the nutritional strategies of organisms to the nutritional strategies in the context of an ecosystem. And so what we'll start doing next is looking in more detail at the thermodynamics of these energy transformations that occur in cells. So I'll see you soon.